Chapter 21 The Enemy of My Enemy. June 21st, 2086. Arcadia Bay, Oregon. It was the first day of summer, and 3 of the Stormbreakers were so incredibly relaxed that it was impossible to tell they were on a mission of great importance. Ninu Dokunle and Scarlett Freeman, both reptiles, stretched themselves out on the rocky cliffs above Oregon's Pacific coastline and took in as much sunlight as they could. Quarter Lang allowed her Lavakian half to take over, and in true feline fashion, the human-shaped lioness was lying on her back and purring while her tail swished back and forth in the grass. In the middle of days like this, Varian, Maui, and Kingi gave up on trying to get their comrades to do any kind of work. They knew Quarter would be much more useful in the twilight hours, since that was when most big cats did their hunting. Setla was best when he was allowed to save his energy by waiting around, and Ninu needed regular breaks to clear his mind. Everyone was playing to their strengths. The spaceplane Niagara was parked on an abandoned stretch of the Oregon Coast Highway. Even though the ship had only been there for a week, the Stormbreakers found they regularly had to clean salt water off the vessel before it built up and caused damage. Today, Varian promised Ninu he could have a rest day. The little reptile was quite tired after mapping out the wellspring of psionic energy that seemed to permeate the region. While Ninu soaked up some sun and snacked on flies, Maui, Varian, and Kingi pored over the map they were working on. "We're going to be here for a while, so let's go over this one layer at a time," Varian said. "Political first. Who's the authority in this region?" "A separatist group calling itself the State of Arcadia," Kingi replied. "They claim to have control over the area, but in reality it's a loose confederation of warlords who've agreed not to shoot at one another." "Where are the other major powers?" Varian asked. "What are their relations?" "The United States government claims all of this territory as their own," Maui said. "Oh, and I mean both United States governments. They're busy fighting each other, and I don't think we should expect to see them here." "The United Nations invaded the Seattle megacity," Kingi added, "but it looks like they've run afoul of the progeny." "Right," Varian said. "And did we ever find out why Arcadia is under the cult of Jericho's protection?" Both Kingi and Maui shook their heads. "And what happened to the alliance between the cult and the UN?" "Strained is what I call it," Maui said. "They're clearly not as good friends as they used to be." "Lots of questions we need answered," Varian said. "What about geography? Points of interest?" Maui pointed to the map. "The United Nations Army and the progeny have forward operating bases in Arcadia Bay. They're keeping away from each other, though. The UN is actually in the town. They've set up in the ruins of Blackwell Academy here. The progeny has taken over the Lighthouse Point and surrounding parkland. UN troops are set up on the Tobanga Trail leading out of town," Maui said. Kingi shook his head. "All right, Varian, this is your planet. Tell us, do any of these locations seem important to you?" Varian compared the handmade map with a century-old tourist brochure they recovered from the abandoned town of Arcadia Bay. He, or she, pointed towards a dirt path that led away from the wreckage of Blackwell Academy. "According to this, Tobanga Trail was set up by the ancient Americans. It's older than the town, older than the United States, older than dirt, probably. But this thing says Tobanga Trail has spiritual significance to the ancient Americans. And don't forget, one of the very first gifted humans lived in this area. So clearly this place was flooded with psionic energy long before Jericho put an end to the gift. Something is going on here, obviously." Ninu overheard Varian's final statement, and his train of thought shifted. To prepare for the mission, Ninu had given himself a crash course on the history of psionics on Earth. There was very little to study. Before the Second Hyperspace War, only 5 gifted humans were recorded, and they were all Americans. The first two were discovered 130 years ago, in the 1960s. William Carter and Myron Falk were founding members of XCOM, but neither one of them lived to the modern era. 50 years would go by before any more were spotted. Max Caulfield, Daniel Diaz, and Alex Chen came next, and they had something unusual in common. All three of them were born in the same region, the rural Pacific Northwest. In fact, Max herself was a native of Arcadia Bay, which seemed to be the nexus of psionic energy permeating the region. Once he landed on Earth and arrived in Arcadia Bay, Ninu did not need to study or read literature. He simply had to walk through these grand forests with an open mind. Now that he knew about psionic sensitivity, Ninu understood why he seemed to fly into a rage when the false Jericho appeared in Michigan. His own mind was being overstimulated by her power. But now that Ninu could recognize an overwhelming amount of psionic energy, he soon learned how to spot a small dose. Over the past week, Ninu had filled out the map with locations where he detected all that remained of the historical human Varian was talking about. When she lived a century ago, Maxine Caulfield, the second gifted human, left behind a kind of calling card whenever she used her power. The town of Arcadia Bay was littered with tiny, barely perceptible ruptures in space-time. To Ninu, they were invisible, but he got a tingling sensation in his spine whenever he drew near to one. Once he reported a rupture, Maui would fine-tune the sensors in the Niagara to see it in greater detail. "If I had to guess," Maui had said, "this Caulfield person must have found a way to manipulate space-time with her gift. One hell of a power." "Not really," Quarter cut in. "Akira Robinson can create black holes, remember?" "You know, if I was gifted, I would make all leaves as delicious as these," Setla said, while snacking on the limb of a maple tree. While everyone else argued over what their unique psionic ability would most likely be, Ninu crept around the area in silence, using his tiny size to stay hidden from UN and progeny patrols. Remembering his readings on psionic history, Ninu retraced Max Caulfield's steps, as best as he could without getting too close to the UN or the progeny. The lighthouse and Blackwell Academy were obviously off-limits, but he did manage to spend some time at the beach, where he found a large number of ruptures. There was another concentration in the ruins of what used to be the downtown area, and a small cluster in a heap of soggy rubble that was probably a house 100 years ago. Once Ninu plotted all of these points on a map, he and the other Stormbreakers came to the same conclusion. "All trails lead to Tobanga," Ninu said. "We need to see where that trail leads." "Can't do that," Kingi sighed. "The enemy is sitting on top of the trailhead." So there was nothing for it but to wait. Wait for the one event that promised to shed light on the matter. Just a few days from now, Scarlett Freeman and Aaron Hyatt were due to arrive. As far as the Stormbreakers knew, Hyatt was already somewhere in the area. Progeny units were being reinforced, and their base around the old Arcadia Bay lighthouse was being turned into a fortress. Heavy laser cannons could be seen behind the walls. They would track any spacecraft that flew over the town, as if they were challenging the UN to pick a fight. As the days wore on, the Stormbreakers became increasingly aware of a building sense of tension. From their hiding place in the forested hilltops, they watched as more and more progeny and UN fighters arrived in the area ahead of the big Hyatt-Freeman meeting. Barricades were set up around the ruins of Arcadia Bay, denying Ninu any further access to the town. The UN army established half a dozen checkpoints on the road leading to the wreckage of Blackwell Academy, and Tobanga Trail was no longer visible from the hilltops. The progeny were digging in as well. Combat trenches were starting to appear on the beach. Anti-aircraft weapons were hidden in the tree line, and heavily armed soldiers were patrolling the periphery of the town. Quarter and Kingi climbed to the top of a nearby hill and scouted the enemy force. "Look down there," Quarter whispered, pointing to a formation of progeny soldiers. "Those must be the battle thralls." Several dozen acolytes of the cult were marching at the head of a column of progeny soldiers. Unlike the UN army, all of these soldiers were aliens, and young ones at that. Quarter winced at the sight of adolescent Levakians who still did not have their manes yet. Partogan and Tydani teenagers looked frightened. Peering through his binoculars, Kingi saw that each thrall had some kind of device fitted around their arms, ankles, or necks. "Tracking devices, I'm sure," Kingi said. "These are probably the young people taken from Rotorua 2 years ago." "Looks like only a small fraction of the progeny force is human," Quarter added. "Just the leadership, acolytes, and sorceresses. Everyone else was kidnapped and enslaved." "I really don't want to see how they would fare in a fight," Kingi concluded. "If it comes to that, we have to prioritize the acolytes and sorceresses." June 25th, 2086. 2 days before Scarlett Freeman was scheduled to arrive in the town of Arcadia Bay, Varian decided to infiltrate the UN camp. She, or he, still had the army uniform they used to trick the Practical CEO a few months back. After a quick briefing with the other 5 Stormbreakers, Varian set out with Ninu staying close behind. The last time Varian wore a disguise, they pretended to be a man. Tonight, Varian reversed course and portrayed a female identity. Keeping his, or her, hair tied up in a bun, Varian took a magnetic rifle from the Niagara's locker and set out just after sundown. Without a military identification card, Varian could not get inside of the UN base, but they were able to move about the parts of Arcadia Bay the UN occupied without being stopped. Other soldiers went about their business as usual, and that business was quite interesting indeed. Scurrying between hiding places, Ninu watched as Varian observed 2 UN troopers. The 2 men spoke casually in Spanish while they waved a handheld scanner over some old wreckage. Fortunately, Ninu had spent a lot of time working in the Celt embassy in Berlin before joining the team. As easily as slipping into a pair of gloves, Ninu's polylingual mind slid into the Spanish language. He could understand the 2 soldiers. "The sooner we find whatever it is they're looking for, the sooner we can leave," one of the Spanish men was saying. "And yet, Command is so stupid they won't even tell us what we're looking for." "Not to mention this place is haunted," the other man said. "I've been getting this creepy crawly feeling ever since we arrived." Realizing the scanners might be important, Varian approached the 2 soldiers in a cautious, demure way that emphasized Varian's feminine side. "Excuse me," Varian spoke in a very convincing female voice. "I'm from the unit down the road, and my CO asked me to see if you guys have a scanner you could spare." Ninu, who up to this point assumed Varian was secretly male, was taken aback by just how convincing Varian was. She, or he, perfectly executed the seductive flutter of the eyelashes, which seemed to seal the deal. Both men held out their scanners, saying they would be more than happy to help out a kind young woman such as herself. Varian took one of the scanners, gave an enthusiastic thanks, and moved back down the road into the darkness. Turning a corner and getting out of sight, Varian waited for Ninu to catch up before they gave the scanner a look. "It's a psionic energy detector," Ninu said. "A miniaturized version of the one on the Niagara. Probably about 50 years more modern than the one we have, too. But why isn't the UN telling their soldiers what they're looking for? Wouldn't it make things easier if the men knew they were searching for psionic energy?" "Operational security," Varian said, still speaking in their female voice. "If word got out the UN was looking for psionic energy, which is not supposed to exist, then who knows how the rest of the world would react to the news? Things could go south in a hurry. The moon rose. Varian and Ninu walked around occupied Arcadia Bay, and soon figured out how to use the psionic scanner. Ninu walked on ahead, taking deep breaths and feeling out the air around him. He was getting really good at detecting psionic energy now. Not only could Ninu pick up on its mere presence, but he was starting to perceive echoes of the intense emotions that sometimes accompanied it. It seemed as though, in her own time, Max Caulfield had a tendency to unleash her full potential in very stressful or emotional situations, leaving behind a much more pronounced trail for Ninu to follow. Varian, however, was limited to the scanner. It simply showed a green light whenever psionic energy was detected. She, or he, had to listen to Ninu's description of points of interest. They visited a rectangular pit where a rusted sign confirmed some kind of diner once stood there. I sense anguish, fear, and panic, Ninu said, layered over top of excitement and a sense of triumph. Around midnight, Ninu guided Varian to an open stretch of ground where very little seemed to grow. Ninu was so overwhelmed by the mental energy in this place that he needed to sit down. There's a lot of sorrow here, Ninu explained. Anger and despair. There was a tragedy in this place. Varian and Ninu took a short break, watching the moon, stars, and occasional starship flying above. So, Ninu, Varian said, slipping back into their gender-neutral voice, why did you say all trails lead to Tobanga Trail earlier? Well, there are 3 reasons, Ninu said. First, there's a high concentration of psionic energy around it. That's definitely why the UN built their base on the trailhead. Second, do you remember that map of the area the Galactic Custodian showed us? The one that showed how psionic energy was permeating the area? Varian nodded. Did you notice the tributary? Ninu said. There was... well, I guess that's the only way to describe it. There are 2 cauldrons psionic energy is flowing out of. One in Arcadia Bay, and another one to the west of here in the mountains. And they're connected. Varian sat up. How? Ninu reached into his pocket and produced the same tourist brochure Varian had used earlier in the week. Tobanga, Ninu replied. It's not just the name of a trail, it's a statue. Ninu read aloud from the brochure. The Tobanga Totem is a Native American relic located on the front lawn of the Prescott Dormitory at Blackwell Academy. Constructed by an unknown tribe, the totem was present in Arcadia Bay before any settlers, and its origins are completely unknown to this day. Many speculate the Tobanga Totem was stolen from somewhere else and then transported to Arcadia Bay. To date, no tribe has claimed ownership of the Tobanga. Ninu folded up the brochure. I'll bet my tail that if you pass your scanner over that statue, it'll light up like a naming day parade, Ninu concluded. Varian punched the air and let out a soft exclamation. Ninu, you're brilliant! I think you're close to figuring this out. With a weak chuckle, Ninu laid down to look at the stars again. Well, I'm glad I can finally do something useful for a change. What's that supposed to mean? Varian asked. Come on, you already know, Ninu grumbled. I'm small. I can't fight. I can't fly the ship. Can't do anything worthwhile. I was useless dead weight until that avian told me I can sense psionic energy. Varian rolled onto his or her side to look at Ninu. You're not dead weight, and you were never useless, Varian said. You're a Stormbreaker, my friend and my brother in arms. That means I trust you, Ninu. It's got to count for something. June 27th, 2086. To the surprise of all 6 Stormbreakers, Scarlett Freeman did not arrive in a starship. In fact, They had no idea how the ISO director arrived in Arcadia Bay. They were forced to conclude that Freeman had smuggled herself into the UN base aboard one of the resupply trucks, which seemed quite in character for a spymaster. The team reluctantly accepted the reality of Scarlett still being alive and set to work. Varian selected 3 spots from which the Freeman-Hyatt meeting could be observed. Corder and Kingi would loiter in a forested hilltop and watch the meeting through a sniper scope. Setla had, almost a full day beforehand, pre-positioned himself inside the ruins of an old department store. He was just close enough to the meeting point to overhear conversations using a listening device. As a low-energy herbivorous reptile, Setla could stay still and remain hidden for days on end if he really needed to. Maui was the furthest away. He was inside of the spaceplane Niagara, using her communications array to eavesdrop on UN military communications. Ninu, being the smallest, was hiding in the debris of a building that collapsed over a century ago. The heap of rubble was so overgrown with shrubbery that it was impossible to spot the little green lizard. Varian had resumed their disguise and was hiding on the second floor of a building that overlooked the meeting place. All 6 of the Stormbreakers were connected to one another by handheld radios, but they were observing a rule of radio silence to maintain stealth. Everybody would stay where they were until nightfall, then escape under the cover of darkness. Shortly before sundown, it began. A convoy of armored trucks, painted with the UN flag, came to a stop in the parking lot of what used to be the local police station. Down the street, about 100 yards away, a similar convoy of vehicles appeared. A mixed force of cultists and their thralls marched down the road towards the meeting point, while a platoon of UN soldiers did the same. Both groups of combatants were in a formation that shielded a high-value individual at their center. When the UN and progeny troops were about 20 feet away, everyone stopped walking. The soldiers at the front of each group parted and stood to the side. Scarlett Freeman was being escorted by Yasin Ackerman, the same UN operative who hunted Inez Espinosa across Michigan. Opposite Yasin and Scarlett, Aaron Hyatt was being closely followed by acolyte Malachi, who was Yasin's partner during the Michigan operation. Scarlett Freeman and Aaron Hyatt stood face to face, leering at one another in such a way that the Stormbreakers instantly knew the alliance between the UN and progeny was dangerously close to falling apart. Scarlett was not wearing her usual business suit. Instead, she was dressed in an XCOM uniform, complete with body armor and a plasma pistol strapped to her leg. Aaron Hyatt was also dressed for combat. She had foregone her typical robes in favor of a more practical, tight-fitting outfit, similar to the hooded vest worn by progeny acolytes and sorceresses. "You are out of line," Aaron said. "You promised me that Arcadia would remain under progeny protection." "I'm altering the deal," Scarlett said coldly. "Pray I don't alter it any further." Aaron clenched her fists. Around her, an atmosphere of rising tension permeated the progeny delegation. Aaron replied, "We've been willing to make sacrifices for this partnership, but I draw the line at theft, Freeman." Scarlett Freeman shook her head, pacing from left to right as she kept her eyes locked on Aaron. "The cult of Jericho has no claim of ownership here," Scarlett said, "especially over whatever is waiting at the end of that trail." At this, Aaron Hyatt and several other progeny members laughed at Scarlett, causing the UN soldiers to look around in confusion. "You don't even know what you're dealing with," Aaron cackled. "Freeman, this is beyond you. There is a wellspring of psionic energy at the end of the Tobanga Trail. You and your soldiers will only defile it with your mundane methods. Leave it to someone who actually needs it, who knows how to use it, to someone who actually deserves it. It was Scarlett's turn to cackle. Deserves, she repeated. Don't make me laugh, Hayat. You've been given more than enough in reward for your services since you joined our cause. And look at how much good that's done, Malachi shouted sarcastically. Several progeny members cheered in support of the outburst. Aaron joined in. My people have seen no such benefits from our so-called partnership, Aaron snapped at Scarlett. We are the ones sent on dangerous raids while the UN sits on its hands. We do the bulk of the fighting in your war. We have sacrificed thousands of potential future thralls and fight under strength just to keep your passion project afloat. And for our struggles and hardship, you reward us with a protected status that means nothing when the whole galaxy is out for our blood. All of the progeny cheered at this. Yasin tried to say something, but Malachi drowned him out. We all saw what happened in Berlin. On the same night that your Secretary General lost control of the Security Council, your vaunted flagship was ambushed. Our people watched as Partogan warships came and went from Earth without being challenged or resisted. Your military has lost the will to fight, and now it's obvious to anyone with a brain on their shoulders. Your government is on borrowed time. Your armies and navies are about to collapse. And soon, there will be a new order. The progeny will do whatever it takes to survive. We won't be dragged down as you fall. Yasin drew his laser pistol and took aim at his former comrade. Is this open treason, cultist? Yasin yelled. Put that toy away, son of a Stormbreaker, Malachi taunted. Don't be fool enough to try it. Your days are up, and there's no point in taking a source of psionic power off your corpse when we can just leave with it right now and nobody gets hurt. So tell your boss to back down. Scarlett looked from Malachi to Aaron. So is that it, Hayat? Scarlett said. Is that really your play? To bail on us as soon as you think we've shown weakness? Is your sense of loyalty really that weak? There was a tense pause. Then Aaron Hayat said, No, but you are. All 6 Stormbreakers were struck blind and deaf by a sudden eruption of gunfire. Laser bolts, plasma beams, and Gauss rounds rained into the ruins like a sudden hailstorm. A wave of heat washed over Ninu as one of the military vehicles exploded into flames. Varian ducked away from his or her window just as someone fired at her or him. Varian tore and pulled their army uniform apart, trying to get rid of the UN symbols. They're fighting each other! Quarter screamed into the radio. Aeneas, it's chaos down there! What do we do? Everyone go loud! Varian replied. Break cover and light up anything that moves. Kill Hayat, kill Freeman, then regroup at the Tobanga Totem.